everyone. Greetings from Singapore. And today, America through the eyes of Susan Danger, AmCham CEO in the EU. In the house, you might have heard our Hamilton opening music. So you know what frame of mind we're in because this is the 4th of July month. So that's why I'm wearing this headset, but I'm going to take it off in a second. As you may be aware, we started this series, America Through the Eyes of, because it is an important year for the U.S., given that it's election year. And I know that you're probably kind of sick of hearing about it, maybe. But the point of this series is not to talk about the election, quite frankly. The point of this series is for us to understand the United States of America a little better than what we do now. Even more so for those of us, like me, who are American, we need to hear feedback. Because if we as a country, if we as Americans are going to get any better, we need to be good about understanding people's perception of the United States. And so we created this series, and we have the privilege of having Susan with us today. Susan has been with AmCham EU since about 1995, if I'm not mistaken. And we are actually very fortunate to have her because she recently announced that she will be retiring as CEO of AmCham EU at the end of the year. So after such a long, illustrious career, I finally have the opportunity to meet her and have this conversation with her. And so we will be able to do this first on LinkedIn Live for about 30 minutes. And we're going to transition over to a private conversation on Zoom. It's not too late to register. The link to register for the Zoom conversation in the second half is available in the comments. So why don't we get started? You ready, Susan?
I'm ready. I'm delighted to be with you, Hsien. Yeah, like the headband.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm not used to wearing headbands. I'm going to take it off. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Susan, usually these conversations are pretty relaxed, free and easy. It's just to get your perspective, and in your case, a perspective of your members on what they think about the United States at this point in time. But I'm actually going to open up more broadly and ask you what your relationship with the United States is, and just tell us your story.
That could be a long one. Bearing in mind my career is fairly advanced now. I had a quick think about that. It's interesting. My initial relationship with the States was a bit mixed, actually, Hsien, because when I grew up in London, and for many years I knew I wanted to travel, but one of the places I didn't want to travel to was the States. And why? Because I had a perception, and I think quite a lot of Europeans did at that time, that America was a little bit arrogant and they thought a lot about themselves. And therefore, I put in my mind as a young 18 to 25-year-old, I want to explore the rest of the world, but I didn't particularly have a need to go to the States. So I'm just putting it out there because you asked me. So my relationship then evolved because I did, after my studies of languages, then spent a year in Germany, actually did my dissertation, I think about it, on the Pershing missiles station. Pershing missiles was stationed in Schwäbisch Gmünd, where I was in Germany. So that's a whole other story. So my relationship started to change, but then went off traveling around the world after my studies and after some various work experiences. And then I met some very nice Americans, and I started being exposed to a bit more to American culture and thought, you know what, maybe it's not so bad. Threw my ticket in Australia and came back from Australia to Europe via America, and I loved it. So therefore, you asked me about my relationship. My relationship has been one of growth, of increasing understanding, and perhaps importantly, this perception of America of being maybe a little bit, which may still exist, I think, dominant, telling other people what to do, is pretty still relevant for today in terms of potentially that relationship with Europe and the States. But it changed for me. Happy to expand on this later about why these personal relationships are so important and having an understanding actually between the States and Europe. But my relationship now with the States, of course, is one connected to the American Chamber of Commerce. So I've been here since 1995. I started as communications director in 95 here. And so a lot of my role now is about creating a really strong relationship, a transatlantic relationship between the entirety of Europe and the US, and making sure it's as positive as possible and that our relationship gets even closer. So pretty good, interesting question, Hsien. I like that.
Well, we're going to get into more about how AmCham EU kind of functions to represent American businesses and American business interests. But since you mentioned that you had no desire to go to the US early on, I'm just curious about where in the United States you've traveled and what have been your impressions of the different places you've visited.
Okay, no, yeah, happy to expand on that. It makes a nice change from the conversations I normally have in Brussels on EU policy. So I've traveled on that, so my first experience of the States was in the West Coast. Coming in to LA, I traveled all the way up the West Coast, sharing a car with some fellow travelers. San Francisco, I loved, all the way up to the top to Seattle, actually into Canada, and then back down through the top states, through Colorado, Denver, back and all the way back down and around. I've walked the Grand Canyon. I've slept a night at the bottom of the Grand Canyon and camped there. I've walked all the way down and all the way up. So that was in the early days. I have also been, in the early days, I've been to Florida. But since then, what else have I done? I've taken a camper van with my kids and my family, I should say, also around California. Most recently, not to bore you with all my trips to the States, this is on the private level. Last year I went to Alaska, which was fabulous, and did Alaska with my youngest daughter. And then after that, we did a camping trip around in certain parts of Alaska, and I loved it. So I really, on a personal level, I really like the national parks are just amazing. I've also been around the Olympic Peninsula last year as well, and done some great treks. Then on a work level, my relationship with where I've been to the States has been generally more city-based. You know, Washington, D.C., a couple of times a year. I've been to, where did we go? North Carolina, to Texas, to actually went to Miami earlier this year with again, when we come to that, with the network of AmChams around Europe. So that's been more from the point of view of understanding that economic and investment relationship. So I've got these two relationships, the personal one, which is I love the outdoors. I think it's the most amazing country. And then this other relationship, which is about how can we get this economic relationship and more than economic, political relationship to be smooth and closer. So you have a great country. It's a great country. Great continent, I should say.
Well, you've mentioned the places and you've certainly covered West and covered East. So next time you cover this, Midwest.
Yeah, that's true.
Specifically to the people, I'm from California. So we always think like, oh, we're from California. And other people are like, oh, you're from California, right? Not the same kind of feeling. I have a friend in Idaho who's like, we don't need any more Californians in Idaho. So it's a bit of a joke. But when you travel around, do you notice that there is a difference between the type of Americans, the kind of ideas that you're sharing? I mean, what have you noticed? Are we more similar than we are different?
What do I notice? Well, I suppose on a very sort of broad level, Washington, D.C. is a government town. So yeah, it's different there, I suppose. It looks more like Brussels looks. The people there are more like Brussels people. The talk is all about politics and very heavy analysis. I mean, everyone spends their entire time analyzing absolutely everything, which is fine. Especially, I mean, I'm sure at the moment in the run up, even a year, 2 years before any election, that's what everyone talks about. So there's certainly a difference, and perhaps even a more sort of a bit of an alignment, because you're more meeting the people that you work with here. Actually, having just been to Miami, I wasn't sure what to expect in Miami. I was like, I think this is going to be big and brash and superb. I mean, absolutely multicultural. It did feel like being in potentially Latin America, not so much Spain, but there. I mean, the color and the vibrancy, the difference, whether the people are more friendly or less friendly, but certainly more diverse, a different type of diversity that you get in Washington, D.C. I think you see a difference in size of people, if I can say that. You've got different in size depending on where you are. I think Washington's maybe possibly a little bit slimmer than some areas of the country, but yeah, everyone is. I think there's a friendly. I know this sounds a bit cliche, but Americans are very friendly in general terms, except at the airports. No, except at the airports, they can be pretty gruff there.
Because we're all stressed out at the airport.
Yeah. Well, no, just the security staff, I would say. The security staff. Yeah, you could do with a bit of upping the game there. They're not particularly friendly. That if you want to give a better impression,
I got you.
You wanted America through the eyes of somebody coming into the country. You want to give you know,
That's
maybe
true.
again, it's this perception that you get that they just assume everyone wants to come into this country and they can be as gruff and as unfriendly as they like. I mean, maybe some point, you know, a bit of friendliness, but once you get into the country and meet the people, superbly friendly.
Oh, that's super interesting to just even think about that angle of how we present to travelers to the United States from the time they step off the plane. So
Yeah,
that's
it feels to be a bit of complacency is there that, you know, everyone, we are the greatest country. So that goes back a little bit to my feeling of whether it's competition or just, I think, on the one hand, it's great that Americans really believe in themselves. I think that's a good quality. They believe in themselves, they're entrepreneurial, they're innovative, they compete. I think that's a great quality. They don't take anything for granted in that respect. I think that's probably maybe one of the differences with Europe as well. I think that, I mean, we can come to that, can expand on that. I think that's that's a good quality. You know, they get up and they go and I think maybe we could do a bit more of that spirit sometimes in Europe.
Yeah, it's a bit of a balance. So this is a great transition to understanding more about what's happening in the EU and what's happening in Europe. Certainly there's, you know, the news is also full of updates on lately on what's been happening in France and the UK. But you're in a really unique situation, in fact, because you are AmCham EU, not AmCham only one country. I think for us to understand better, we do out here in our region have a grouping called ASEAN, as you know, but the way ASEAN functions is nowhere near the way EU does with shared currency and whatnot. So I think we could use a little bit of a 101 on how AmCham EU can represent on the EU front, but also have all these individual AmChams within the different countries. Could you just kind of give us a 101 on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the 101 is there are 50 AmChams in what we call Europe and wider Europe. So that's Europe and Eurasia. So obviously not just the EU. They're all completely independent and they're all affiliated to the US Chamber in Washington, D.C., probably as you are. So we're all independent AmChams. We all abide, as probably you do, by certain rules, which is you have to have a certain number of Americans, certain number of American companies, and you have to show your budget, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, each of those AmChams are run by their members. Of those, we have a network of, we call it ACE, AmChams in Europe, which is a loose network of those chambers and those chambers get together twice a year, once in somewhere in Europe and once in DC, actually. DC and then a second city, hence earlier this year it was DC and Miami. And there we exchange, that's the directors, and we exchange on best practices and try and, you know, talk about some of the bigger issues, although it's hard to talk about. We don't do policy because with 50 different AmChams from 50 countries, you can imagine that would be pretty tricky. But what all those AmChams do, the majority of those are focused on their country. So let me take AmCham France. AmCham France focused on what's happening in France, French-US relationship, but also trade and investment conditions in country. The same for Belgium. There's an AmCham here in Belgium. So there are 2 in Belgium and there happen to be 2 in Turkey. There's an AmCham Belgium. They're focused on Belgium, making sure that Belgium remains as competitive as possible. Where does AmCham EU come into that? AmCham EU actually started out as a very small committee of AmCham Belgium. So in 1962, Common Market Panel was formed by some American companies who said, hey, look, they're forming this new thing called the EC, the European Community. We need to discuss this. We need to be in on this. Common Market Panel grew and grew and grew into something in the 1980s that they then said, well, we need to make it a committee now. It's the EC committee. That grew and grew and changed into the EU committee when the European Community EC changed to the EU. So it was then the EU committee of AmCham Belgium. And I joined in 95. It was the EU committee of AmCham Belgium. It was already larger than AmCham Belgium at that time. It already had 10, 11, 12, 14 staff, and AmCham Belgium had 5. Fast forward to 2002, I became MD and managing director in 2002. We then decided to split and rebrand. So in 2002, 3, 4, we split this committee from AmCham Belgium and said, we need an AmCham in our own right with the same mission. And so we then rebranded and became AmCham EU and an independent organization. Why? Because what AmCham EU does is it focuses on the entirety of the EU. We focus on lobbying, you could say, advocacy work towards the EU institutions. Our overall mission is to create a competitive Europe for our companies. We have two overarching priorities. One is to build a strong and united European Union, the EU, and secondly is to maintain and strengthen the transatlantic relationship. So essentially what AmCham EU does, if you want to have a simplified difference between it, is we are the advocacy lobbyists. Our members are not comprised of the business leaders, the marketing, the sales, the operations professionals. Our members are the government affairs, corporate affairs, lawyers who are doing this lobbying, government relations for those American companies. I don't know if you want to.
That is really different.
So we currently have just maybe, so on AmCham EU, we currently have, I think we have 157 member companies. We only represent US companies. Although we have a category, we have some lawyers and consultants, but they have to represent US companies. And we have a very small international category, which we're being, measured with. They have to have significant US business interests. We have 15 committees. We cover issues ranging from agro-food, food security, to consumer affairs, to trade, to environment, to transport and energy. We're covering a whole range of issues. We issue about 80 position papers on this a year. We've already done 46 so far this year. We do numerous meetings. Each committee has a work program. Each committee has a chair. They're going out, meeting with stakeholders in the EU institutions, but also all around Europe. So in all these different, we call them member states, in order to influence either upcoming legislation or potentially, ensure correct implementation of existing legislation, and also to be a bit more forward-looking, and perhaps to sort of tie it together. At the moment, our biggest priority at the moment is, some of you, and maybe I'm sure you're aware that we've had, as you mentioned, actually a lot of we've had the EU elections in June for the European Parliament, meaning there'll be a leadership shift in the European Commission and the European Council. It becomes a bit complicated over here in Europe with all these different institutions, as well as a lot of national elections. So we're focused on that. We're focused on getting our messaging out to all these new people. And yet, indeed, there's been a lot of change. There will be a lot of change. So you have to, every 4 years, you've got to restart and get those messages out, build up new relationships with all these new people, and maintain the relationships with the existing people. Our top line messaging at the moment, which on the most serious front for AmCham, for US companies, is that we're deeply concerned about the attractiveness of Europe. I mean, it's interesting talking to, Asia on this, companies are concerned, the decisions based in the US are, do we put our new investments in Asia? Or do we put them in Europe? And we're always hearing, Asia, 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 this is where they're going. And so there is concern here about Europe becoming, whether it's a museum, whether it's not, just a bit too staid and slow in its regulatory processes, or too much regulation. Very concerned about that. So, I mean, if you want me to, Hsien, but I'll stop there for a minute. I'm very happy to just give you those 3 focus areas of where our priorities lie with regard to concerns for business.
Yeah, that is super interesting. I didn't consider that there's that dynamic between Europe and Asia, which of course there is, because one of the, I wouldn't say it's a complaint. I maybe use that word too strongly. It's more of just the realization that when we're in Asia, and definitely in my previous corporate role, we were very aware that Europe as a market is bigger still in many ways than Asia. Even if you start to say Asia Pacific, including China, down to Australia, New Zealand, and India, this region, although we have the world's largest population contained with what we call Asia Pacific, from a revenue perspective for many countries, for many companies, it's still probably less than 30%, all right? Including Japan, by the way, for many companies. So we're very aware that the US is the world's largest market. Europe is very established, and a lot of businesses have, large revenue generated out of Europe. So how do we as Asia compete, not necessarily on the revenue front, but on a resourcing front? Because what we're saying is you need to invest in Asia. We have a huge consumer base here. We need to push Asia along, because at some point we're going to get to where we are going to be able to generate significant revenue, but not if we're always having to think about US and Europe first. So I think that is actually quite interesting, because many of our members who will be joining this particular session with us are in that same frame of mind as me, which is not that we're in competition with our colleagues in Europe, but that we need to build the case that Asia is worth investing in now, even if we haven't caught up to the revenue size of Europe at this point in time.
Okay, no, interesting. I mean, it's interesting talking to you because, what we're hearing is that, these investment decisions are, Asia is where, excuse me, is the place to go. And companies now, not all sectors, but some sectors are really having second thoughts about it. I mean, there was a recent report from EY, who I imagine EY is probably a member of AmCham Singapore as well, where it showed that actually for the first time ever, the US investment in Europe had gone down. It's saying that in 3 years from now, the companies are still feeling a bit more positive and the attractiveness will go up, but the investment's going down. Because we look at it, I don't know if you've ever seen something we produced, which it could be very interesting for your members and audiences, it's behind this banner now, actually. I had a copy of it here, but if you'll allow me a second, is something called, oh gosh, the transatlantic economy. We produce this every year, which for different reasons, but we really track the investment figures by state, by member state. We basically stress that it's the investment more than the trade. It's almost more important. It's this future investment. It's the investment relationship. But we track in this by member state what the US investment is, how many jobs are created by US investment. And we also do the same for European investment by state in the US. It's quite interesting. It's online, actually. So if anyone wants to take a look at it, and we have a platform there online in this sort of mini version. But back to the concerns, I think, Hsien, it's important to say that what our companies are really concerned about in Europe, the number one is we call it competitive, sustainable, and digital single market. So the EU is not yet a complete single market, but it is a single market. It still needs more harmonization. But they're very concerned about the regulatory burden in Europe. So this is what comes up all the time when they look at other areas of the world. And on the one hand, you're pretty aware that the EU is to a certain extent exporting its regulation. It's almost like but is that a good thing or not? It's a good thing in that if everyone else in the world is aligned with regulation, that makes it easier for business. The issue here is that businesses feel that there's just too much, too complex, it's duplicating, it's overlapping, and it takes a long time. So this is starting to really, the message has got through to the decision makers at the moment. I mean, that's one piece of that bucket of what their concerns are, as well as not feeling that Europe is perhaps as innovative in providing as innovative environment as other areas of the world are. The second focus area of what we call our attractiveness of Europe is ensuring that Europe stays resilient. We call it a strong and resilient Europe on the international scene, and making sure that trade agreements are being set up. And there's been a few of those recently, that the transatlantic relationship remains strong. The security element is, of course, big over here, that you're going to see that going much higher up the agenda with the new EU legislators coming in and the new EU leadership. They've already said there might be a security and defense commissioner in the what we call the European Commission over here. So in security, both economic and political security is absolutely at the top of the agenda. And then the third piece of our attractiveness of Europe agenda is an equitable and democratic Europe. So really looking at standing up for values. We have, inclusion, but I'm talking about values here of democracy and so forth. With the different elections happening here. I mean, you may have followed what's happened in France, and that there was a lot of there was anxiety. Well, I mean, we're non-political here, but there was a significant amount of anxiety about the potential swing of France to the right, which we've seen, although now it's pulled back a bit. But there was still a swing in the EU elections, even though that won't fundamentally change the composition of the European Parliament going forward. There is still a trend there. So just standing up for values and democracy is key. So in this third bucket, it's also about the future of the EU and thinking about potential enlargement. Do you get Ukraine in? Do you have Moldova joining? And what about the relationship with the UK? And also in there as well, slightly different angle, is the skills piece. There's a concern amongst companies here about the shortage of relevant skills in order for them to stay competitive. That's a big deal for them.
Sure.
I mean, and I would, if anyone's interested in more details on that, do look, do do look on our website. It's all good AmChams, and this is what we call our attractiveness of Europe agenda for action. So any of the companies who are interested could take a look at that and find out more. So.
Well, so that leads to another question, this idea of attractiveness of Europe. So thinking about some of the sentiments in the United States, one of the challenges in the last couple of years has been, if you want to talk about trade, then the question then it has to be worker centric. And by worker centric, we're talking about workers in the United States. So how do you actually message that? You're representing American companies, of course, then in that sense, from a national patriotic point of view, think, okay, how do American companies overseas support what's happening in the United States for our Americans? How do you reconcile that? Because we've definitely gotten the message from the US government that we want you to think about the narrative. Of course, we're very happy that there are investments being made and American companies are doing well, but what part of this narrative will then be about American workers and how all of this translates to benefiting the United States?
It's actually a really good point, Hsien, and I think perhaps that was a very good exercise for us in the Trump administration, when Trump was president, during that time, we had to make an incredibly strong case for that. It's like, I mean, I know it's actually President Biden and his administration who have focused on the worker-centric piece, but just talk about people in general. And maybe you went through this as well, had to make the case for why are American companies even in Europe? Why are you investing in Europe? Why are you not investing in the US? What about jobs in the US? What is the benefit for America, I'm talking in very simple terms, for businesses to be there? Okay, great, you're doing well, all this investment, you're creating all these jobs in Europe, but hang on, we want jobs back in the US. So all to say, I think it's an interesting one and not an easy one. We had to make the case and have another narrative, which was true, it was based on, but look, if American companies do well, and we have figures, I think it's 55%, actually, we had to show why Europe, in our case, why Europe was so important. I think the figure was 55% of all US affiliate profits overseas globally come from Europe. So, but then what it means is that a lot of that is then going back to the States and being reinvested in innovation, in research, and it is creating jobs. So you need to show that this dynamic relationship, or that it's two-way. I think also we have to show why that transatlantic relationship is so important and how it's actually intertwined, how it's not a one-way street. Show actually with this relationship and being us so interlinked, look at all that European investment that's actually in the States as well, which is maybe happening because of the strength of these investments. I mean, you just look at how many European companies are also invested in the US and creating jobs as well. So it's not just one way. And ultimately then bring it to your question on worker-centric is the job creation bit, or somehow we need to show how living standards are going up. And that it's a harder one to do and not always so easy for an AmCham, because it's not in our sort of bread and butter work that's what we are paid to do. But I think chambers have shifted a little bit over the years, ever since TTIP actually, Hsien, when we had, I don't know if you were around when the transatlantic trade investment partnership, I think there was a bit of complacency then as well about, everyone should just understand why this trade relationship is, why we should have a trade relationship, why it makes obvious sense that we should get closer. And it wasn't obvious. And then we had to start coming out with stories of why people would benefit. Oh, look at local people. This is what companies are doing, which helps people. And I think we have a role to roll out some more of those stories about how people benefit from what some of these big corporates are doing. Not easy, but we need to constantly be doing it. We actually have a platform called Invested in Europe. Actually, Elise, my colleague who's on the line here, is a fantastic, now it took it on a few years ago, the author of that, and has just revitalized it. But it's one of our communication tools of showing, hey, look, we get in stories from members who say what they're doing and how this is benefiting Europe. So I think it links to this worker-centric piece, Hsien, in an indirect way, but it obviously needs to be, I think the US Chamber as well does it in the US as well, to some extent.
No, I mean, as AmChams, we kind of we have to balance ourselves, isn't it, to where we're currently where we're focused. So for me, it's Singapore versus understanding what's happening in the U.S. and making sure that that relationship is strong, because that at the end of the day, we're representing American business interests. And so sometimes I get a little confused, to be honest, like, how do I talk about this so that it, helps our American companies and help corporate headquarters understand why it's important to continue investing in Asia while at the same time, dealing with the dynamics back home in the United States. Before we finish off our LinkedIn part, a LinkedIn Live portion, I do want to ask just one more serious question, which is more about, you are going to be relinquishing your role as CEO of AmCham EU at the end of this year, which I can imagine that some people might think, ooh, that's tricky timing, because this year we have so many elections happening around the world. Things are kind of in turmoil. And while we completely respect that you may have made this decision for any number of reasons, but how is AmCham EU going to continue to do its work? What's going to change, because there's so much unpredictability in the world right now. And as we click over into 2025 in really only about 6 months, what's that going to look like for AmCham EU?
It's interesting. Yeah, a lot of people have asked me the question. To a certain extent, you could ask, why am I stepping down? Just we've got all this change. You could do with somebody to lead through that change. Saying that, it's also a good time for someone else to come in and make all those new relationships in the EU election, in the EU, and in the US potentially as well. I don't think it's a bad time. I think in that respect, it's a good time. I think every chamber requires fresh blood at a certain point, and after certain reasons, although I hope you can tell, I'm full of energy. I have plenty of energy. I just think now it's time to put it somewhere else and move on. I think, how is AmCham going to do it? We have a great legacy. I think another reason why I'm very happy to go at this point is because our reputation is strong and high. We're in a stable position. I just had a member in who said, what, AmCham EU is just known everywhere we're trusted. We're known for our expertise, our experience, standing up for values. We have a really strong team who are excellent. So there'll be continuity within the team. I think also one basic of an AmCham is, we built up this legacy, so the reputation is there. So you obviously got to maintain it. Is having a solid way of working. It sounds a little bit boring, but rules. We have pretty strong rules and guidelines about, we're non-political, how we work with others, how we form a position. You can't pay and get a position paper put out. There are rules about that. So assuming you stick by some of these fundamentals, which in years back was like, oh, it's so bureaucratic. It's not bureaucratic. It's actually one of the fundamentals of why we are respected, because people trust us. They know, hey, if they put out a position and a message, it's been signed up to by 157 companies. We know that it has, not a few bigger companies paid a bit more money and got that out. So I think that's one thing. I think we're in a stable place, but we have a creative team. We pride ourselves on fresh blood coming on the board, and there's a healthy turnover in staff, so to reinvent ourselves. I'm confident that AmCham EU will continue to be, whoever leads it will continue to be up there and be leading the way on transatlantic relations.
Awesome. Well, just so that you're always welcome out here in Singapore. And I know my colleagues in other AmChams, including Heidi, who's at AmCham Thailand, we're admirers of yours. I think others should also look up, and I'll have to find this link, where I first encountered your thinking and your depth of just, sensible approach to just life and career. I learned from this podcast that I heard you on. So you're always welcome to Asia if you would like to come and visit us.
Yeah, I'm not retiring yet. I'm taking a break. I'm taking a break down under, and then I'm gonna think about.
Well, you're gonna be nearby. You should stop by Singapore.
If I pass through, that's maybe given me an idea to pass through Singapore. I've never been to Singapore. I've never been to Singapore. I need to pass through on my way down under, I think.
And that's a great idea, and we'd love to host you.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. So before we transition out of LinkedIn Live to our Zoom session, which folks can still register to join, I'm going to ask you 3 quick rapid fire questions that are super fun. Okay. So the first one is, what's your favorite American food?
Crab cakes.
Crab cakes,
Yeah,
nice.
yeah, I don't know why, because you can't get them here.
Oh, really?
No,
What?
no, you can't get them here. Usually when I go to DC, if I'm in a restaurant, I mean, most things you can get here. I can get a steak here. Actually, I'm vegetarian. I put it out there. I'm vegetarian. I eat fish, but no, I don't eat meat anymore since 2019. Doing my bit for the environment, I have to say,
Gotcha.
cutting down on the too many cows around. So I do like a good crab cake with a nice bit of sauce,
Aw,
and maybe
nice.
a piece of cheesecake afterwards could go down quite well, or a
Perfect.
moist chocolate brownie, maybe. Yeah.
I lived for a while in Baltimore, Maryland, and we have pretty darn good crab cakes there. So
Oh,
I
right.
support you.
Okay. Yeah, crab
Yes.
cakes are good. Yeah.
Second question. What's your favorite American city?
This is a tough one. I usually say San Francisco because,
Aw.
oh,
And you
sorry.
didn't say that because of me, right? Because I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area.
Oh, no, I didn't know that. I didn't know
I
that.
did not influence you to have that
Um,
answer.
I think San Francisco, saying that, I was a bit struck last time I was in San Francisco that there were a lot of homeless people. I
It's
was
sad.
there
Yeah, it's
two
very
years
sad.
ago and I was a little bit shocked. Not that that means it's no longer my favorite city, because I love that it's European, the trams, the hills, the sea, lots to do there, and great around it. Napa Valley you can go up to, so, and the people are great. But I was a bit concerned about the prices, and it was very expensive, and perhaps the homelessness.
Yeah.
But apart from that, I still keep it on my list as a, yeah.
Yes, our
But I
leaders
did
are
enjoy it. It's
definitely
not a
working on
city.
that.
It's not a city, but I did enjoy Alaska. Alaska was amazing.
Oh, yes. I think we just recently hosted one of the senators here in Singapore. So
Ah,
definitely
right.
Alaska
Okay.
is amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Last one, also a trick
Yeah.
question. Who's your favorite American?
You know what? I would say work related. His name is Joe Quinlan. He's been a friend and colleague of ours here at AmCham EU for about 25 years. He's the co-author of this transatlantic economy.
Oh,
And he's just a great guy because he says it like he is. So firstly, he's a great person for the team to work with. He does the amazing presentations. He doesn't beat about the bush. He's from New York, and he just says, this is how it is, Susan. This is what's happening. And he doesn't try and sugarcoat it, which is what a lot of you get with Brussels and Washington. It's all very diplomatic speak, and we have to be very careful what we say. So, it's hard to say a favorite person. I was a great admirer of President Barack Obama and enjoyed his speeches. Is there an actor I like? They're all fabulous. It's pretty hard to come down to one. So let's give Joe a bit of credit for everything
that's
he's done for
awesome.
AmCham EU for the last 25 years.
Well done, Joe. I hope you're watching this and know how much Susan thinks very highly of you. So we're
Yeah, I
going to make
do.
sure
He's
we
a
reap
good friend
that
too.
transatlantic economy that we also put the link up for everyone to download. So, all right, team. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining LinkedIn Live. Now the AmCham Singapore team will transition us off over to Zoom.